that's one of the things too. I always like to have, especially at the beginning and ends of chapters. I was just speaking with an actress today, and on a number of my actor interviews that I've done with people, I've talked about the little moments in films being where great actors really strut their stuff, rather than the Oscar
Yes.
reel scenes where someone's in a hospital and the mother's dying, or they're breaking up with a lover, or this or that. That holding something back is often the thing. And so there are those scenes, and some of them are stretched to grand Shakespearean heights, like the sneakers scene. Others of those are things like you had talked about earlier, the last time we talked about a scene where two of the characters, the priest and Tony Luff, in the confession booth, and one of them farted, and there's something more than two men in the booth. But we're not talking necessarily about the fart or the odor. They both are hypocrites in a sense. So that's one of the things too. Is oftentimes, if you read uh, books or writers that people often say, claimed, the morals of most Russian novelists, for example, or Ayn Rand. A lot of the stuff is very heavy-handed because they have to say exactly what their personal philosophy is. And there are certainly times in books or in poems when I've directly turned to a reader and stated something, or had a character state something. But on the other hand, it also makes for pretty bad prose 99 times out of 100. So having these little scenes that takes someone out of something. One of my favorite quote unquote little scenes, although you could say it's a major dramatic moment for the characters, is earlier in the book where Sonny Liston is approached by one of the goons from the Foundation. And we get an insight into Sonny Liston, that between the two major scenes that he has of the two fights with Cassius Clay, there's this little scene where he's approached by the Foundation guy. And we get an insight into a character that we don't really need to know anything more about Sonny Liston. He's the most well developed of the black characters in the book. There's a Foundation guy who's developed. There's the Johnny Mathis kidnap scene and a few other minor characters. But uh, those scenes are not only to give a character and to a little breather dramatically, but it's also to give a sense of that world. Um, you know, in this book that I'm doing now, a science fiction book, I have to do that because I have to project the world that's an eon and a half in the future. Uh, but I also have to be wary that if someone reading this book in 500 or 1,000 years, things that you and I take for granted, like who Andy Warhol and Truman Capote are, they may be long forgotten in 1,000 years. Uh, that you have to give them the care, even as tertiary or quaternary level characters, as you would to primary or secondary characters, because, as I said, in the year 2800, who knows if Truman Capote is going to be a little bit more than a minor 20th century writer. And so they're not going to know his status as a homosexual in 20th century America, uh, uh, and how he has some political or artistic input to quote unquote gay artists of now. So you have to give a sense of who he is, even though his one appearance is kind of outrageous. You get a sense of the man's petulance and his bigotry and his small-mindedness and his just plain nastiness and competitiveness with someone like Warhol. And that gives the character, even though he's a fictionalized version of a real character, something to latch onto other than him being, oh, he was that 20th century writer. No, someone in 2800 who may never have read a Truman Capote book will say, oh, I remember that character, Truman Capote, he was based on a real guy, and there was that scene where he said this and that, and it'll give an added dimension that will give the book resonance, just as now I have to to limn a very complete world set in the future. Those people who are in that future to come, looking back, are going to have to know something about it. The same way that Melville uses his intercalary chapters about whaling to give a fuller picture. Instead of my having intercalary chapters or chapters like the legend teller stuff from Tumbleweeds, I do it within these little small moments. that say, oh, here's how a lonely guy, Luft, for example, might be spending a night alone with a major holiday coming. What does he feel like? And even though he's a dope, and even though he's a killer, and he's a bad human being, you should be able to feel a little bit of something for him.